right. Thank you everyone for coming. Lovely last day of August. It's beautiful where I'm at. Hopefully you're enjoying nice weather as well. And thank you for joining us for managing prescriptive and auditable regulations in OT. That's quite a big mouthful. I want to be clear that there's potentially lots of ground to cover under this particular topic. And I want to try and focus, like I said, the managing portion. This is where most people get in trouble. And there were some pre-questions sent in around specific details. I'll try to hit some highlights. But what I'm mostly trying to do is take from our experience, both as a company and my experience personally, professionally, and share with the audience what some of the biggest challenges are to actually doing this day in and day out. I mean, anybody can buy security tools, anybody can write a policy and procedure. The actual value is in the ability to adhere to those and to successfully execute against it. And so today we're going to talk a lot about some of the underlying focus of what we need to do, why that's a challenge in OT, and what we've seen successful companies do. And I have not one, but two case studies to share with you today. Please feel free to use the chat function if you had questions, or I'm going to pause on people putting hands up and answering questions in line. But if there's a chat question for the end, or if we have some time, I can take some of those pre-submitted questions. So a little bit of background on myself. My name is Rick Kahn. I am the VP of Solutions at Verve. All that means is that I take my, as you can see there, 21 years of ICS security experience in a global role with Honeywell and some local roles with Matricon, and over 2 decades of seeing this evolve as a topic in both North America and globally. And hopefully I bring that to bear when I engage with our clients in helping to solve the problem, because everybody has similar challenges. Security is a program, not simply a single function or technology. And so when we can bring creative solutions to problems and challenges, better off we both are. I did work, like I said, for Honeywell, which is massive and incredibly rewarding to be a part of and to learn things and see different places. I've had the privilege of being in Saudi Aramco shortly after Shamoon. I've never seen 37 people show up to an OT security meeting. Usually we get 3 to 7, not 37. But I've also seen how mom and pop pulp and paper mills do this in rural Canada, et cetera. I'm hoping to bring some of that to today's discussion and any future engagements we may have together. I work for Verve now, and Verve is back to my roots in Matricon, and they're a vendor-neutral systems integrator, wanting to help the client with their problem, regardless of the OEM vendor, equipment, or investment that they have. We do come from a long history of OT experts. In fact, 28 years ago, we started as an automation vendor doing system integration, PLC programming, DCS upgrades, et cetera. And as you can see there, for 15 years, we've been developing our own ICS management or industrial cybersecurity management toolset that we've been deploying into OT environments for years now. And in the last few years, we've significantly expanded into multiple geographies, but more importantly, multiple industries, as more and more similar looking environments, i.e. operational technology, start to come under the purview of either regulatory or corporate expectations. So for an agenda today, I'm going to try and cover these. These are high level, and I'll do better or worse at some of these as we get into the subsets and the categories. Most importantly, what is the objective? The question and the teaser for this to have people come was that this is about managing regulatory. Now, regulatory can mean a couple things to different people depending how you define it. I mean, obviously, if you have a government mandate and there's fines imposed if you don't follow it, that's pretty straightforward. But more and more organizations are getting mandates from insurance companies, from board of directors, from risk and audit term teams internally that are trying to protect the company brand, but also the safety and product spec. And so there's a whole bunch to choose from, and I will touch upon some of them, again, not only to help frame the context, but to maybe share some of the commonalities, and again, potentially solicit some feedback for future sessions. I'm going to talk a little bit about what traditionally has been done. In over 20 years in my experience, I've seen the coming of the silver bullet not once but twice, and in neither case has it actually worked. That's what I call the easy button there. Many times people are enticed by the opportunity to hit what they think is an easy button, only to realize that the promise of get out of jail without doing the work isn't actually realistic. And then a little bit about why we've done this. It's not fair to just say we're lazy or that we can't be bothered, we're afraid of hard work. There are real constraints that are holding us back from doing what we do in IT. I want to make sure we highlight that a little bit because it really does underlie the challenges we have and inform, hopefully, your decisions and your thought process as you go through this. We've made some significant learnings from that. Like I said, I've got a couple of case studies. I also have some anecdotal stuff I want to share, and I want to show you what successful companies are doing, and that's exactly what leads me into my two different case studies. I did open it up for questions at the end. Like I said, we can put stuff in the chat window between now and then if you'd like, or I can use some of the pre-answered questions, assuming how time goes. But hopefully this is enough content for us to get through today, and it's worth your while coming today. Again, I appreciate you sharing some time with us. So what are we after? And I put a number of things in here that you could potentially talk about. I'm going to walk through. As you see at the bottom there, I've got the double star. This is my only informal poll. I'm not going to spin up anything technically or whatever. In the Zoom, Zoom, we're in our WebEx, we're in WebEx, there is the opportunity to put your hand up. And if you'd like to put your hand up, please do. I'm not going to address you now, but it just indicates for me that you would maybe like a follow on, because some of the questions we got were, tell me more specifically about the API 1164, or what is it about, or what standard to use. There were a lot of questions about the standards, which again is an important subcomponent of this topic, but not necessarily going to be the focus of today. So if anybody's interested, please do put your hand up, and we'll definitely invite you to a subsequent session where we dive deeper into the specifics. So I'm going to start at the top though, NERC-CIP. NERC-CIP is the first one, at least in North America, and that is enforced with government requirements and lawyers and fines, monetary fines. NERC-CIP is now followed by the Security Directive Pipeline 2021, the TSA that everyone's talking about, what is getting a lot of interest. Now, the interesting thing between NERC-CIP and TSA is that TSA sort of said, here's what you shall do, and only pipelines get to know what's in there. So, admittedly, we're aware of some of there's obviously some public components to what's required there. There's some private components that are only for pipeline operators, whereas NERC-CIP is a very publicly written group edit. If you want to see a masochistic exercise, just trying to group editing around a regulatory standard with a whole bunch of lawyers. Really well-intentioned people, very, very big brains and smart people, but it does mean that NERC-CIP has taken multiple iterations to get to where they are. Both have a framework of basic building components and security requirements as applied to OT. The third one on the list is the CIS 18. It used to be known as CIS 20, Center for Internet Security. It is a very interesting one, and I like to include it in here because when people ask me, what do we look for a program or standard? This one at least has maturity levels. It has a first pass of what you're trying to do. We're not trying to become ultra marathoners the first time out if we've been sitting on the couch for 20 years. And the CIS has multiple phases to grow into. It also has maturity levels within each of the subcategories. So it's a pretty good how-to guideline. There is, of course, the probably longest serving one, the IEC 99, IEC 62443. This is a bunch of individuals like myself and vendors and whatnot that contribute to a body of knowledge and build different standards. And then there's, of course, the NIST CSF. And the reason I put it before the API is because the NIST CSF actually maps directly to the API. And I've got a slide that shows that in a bit here. The NIST is a framework document. The NIST framework document attempts to try and understand commonalities amongst all the ones I've said above, as well as a few others like COBIT and ISO, et cetera. And NIST actually maps directly to the API. And so NIST is a pretty good overview and overall sort of discussion when you're talking about the basic building blocks of OT security, right? But it does point out that all of the above, whether it's implied or explicitly stated, is that these all require a risk-based implementation. One of the biggest challenges in OT is we've never had a problem before. Why should we have a problem now? Or I don't know if that happens, or what's the possibility or probability that's going to happen. And that's why we try to take those discussions away by looking at risk. And I've got a slide that talks about it. But that's sort of a key component throughout this presentation. If we don't know what our risk is, then we can't make informed decisions. And unfortunately, a risk comes from the actual operations we're in, far different from IT, because a Windows computer running a catalytic cracker or a safety system has potentially catastrophic circumstances or results relative to a mail server or a file server on the IT side of the house. And so risk becomes almost supersized in this space. The common objective, though, is that we're trying to take common IT security controls into OT environments. One of the biggest challenges I have when talking to IT people is I say, look at all this information and data we can show you. They say, well, I've got that dashboard. They know that because they're looking at a similar vulnerability or patch dashboard. What they don't know is how they got to that point, right? It's a big difference, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The idea, though, is that we need to use, again, like I said, risk-based. And in fact, if you look, the most recent release or the update to the TSA guidelines were almost a reflection on the fact that they tried to take this very strict, this is what security means and how it shall be applied, and said, OT, figure out how to do it. The reality is, especially when you're talking pipelines and SCADA and long haul with thousands of assets across hundreds and thousands of miles of geography, it's not practical, nor is it necessarily an equal level of risk or impact, right? And so you have to be careful to balance what we're trying to achieve with, does it actually do anything better, and what is the cost of doing so? Even more so, it's exponentially more focused in OT. The other thing we're trying to do is first identify risk. One of the questions was, how to identify BES cyber systems in one of the first questions. NERC SIP has started with, figure out what can take you offline within 10 minutes, an unplanned or unexpected, maybe it's 15 minutes, unplanned or unexpected scenario that's going to take you offline and stop producing what you're supposed to be doing. Now identify the systems that support or manage or prevent that, right? That's how we start to drill down into risk, right? What we need to do then is be able to take that information and now go and demonstrate that I've identified those assets, I'm protecting those assets, and the application of those controls needs to be demonstrated within a regulatory or a management program. And then the final challenge, right? So first is to understand what we're doing. The second is to then practically apply those in a consistent manner. And then the third is to be able to maintain that, right? I know of a consultant that got a project to run around and harden a bunch of systems for a refining company. When they were done, the refining company said, great, how do I see that that's been done? How do I know? The answer was, well, you need to log into those systems to see that we've made the changes we said we would make. And the second question was, well, how do I know if those change? And the answer is, well, you need to log into those systems to see if that change had been made. That's a real challenge, right? We can not really demonstrate the application in that scenario, and we certainly can't guarantee that we're maintaining them. And this is where a lot of the effort gets into trouble. Again, regulated, there's a problem in terms of finance and potential penalties, but in just general best practice, there's potentially an impact to safe operations. So what have we traditionally done when faced with these things? What has NERC SIP taught us in terms of what they've done? They've gone first, they've sort of blazed the trail. Well, we often buy individual tool sets for individual functions, hence the messy toolbox up here. And that's a common response to an IT approach. We have specialists in IT that are very good at networking gear, that are very good at perimeter detection, that are very good at hunting for the bad guys. Maybe they're excellent at vulnerability analysis. Maybe they're fantastic at patching. It builds silos, it builds expertise, but it builds silos. And often some of those tools are ill-suited for OT, hence my little parking garage thing here. Scan-based vulnerability tools, for example. Scan can knock things off in OT. And if IT loves the scan-based approach, and I show them a vulnerability dashboard from an OT environment, it looks very much like an IT one, but what's underlying there is that we had to use very different tool sets to get there. Now, when we use different tool sets and what we're used to in IT, we need different skill sets. And often, we have to backfill the gaps, especially if it's an IT tool, to use manual effort to fill those out. So just expanding on the scan-based vulnerability approach, if I don't scan all my systems because they're a bit fragile in OT, how do I fill the gaps in my vulnerability mapping of that environment? Can I do scanning on primary systems on odd numbered days and then backup systems on even numbered days? Can I do them during outage? Is that acceptable as an organization to have vulnerability scans that are only tied towards outages or downtime? This means that best effort often ensues, but again, can cause significant gaps, and that's where we get to the sort of whack-a-mole. And this is what we find many organizations are doing, that once they set up a system or a program, they try with manual effort and change control and user behavior and then periodic audits to try and keep that up to date. But the reality is it's never nearly as accurate or as efficient as they might like. And in the case of a regulated environment, I'm sure you know who this company is, but I choose not to punish the unfortunate. There was a power company that was found to have systemic failures across multiple sites in this sort of approach, this kludge together of manual systems, spreadsheets, user and change control logs being then going to back and update the inventory, and hopefully that's good enough. They settled a negotiated fine of $10 million for systemic failure and gaps in their following for about a 5-year. This is published in 2019. So in a 3-year span, they had enough following findings that they were able to negotiate down to a $10 million footprint. So bringing it back to the challenge though, we can argue for different tool sets, we can argue for different approaches, but what are we trying to focus on? The challenge is actually properly grasping risk. Now, anyone who's done any sort of OT or vulnerability analysis knows that you always talk about likelihood of something happening along with the impact. Now, likelihood is something that we need to look at the threat intelligence and the threat feeds, et cetera. Now, it is somewhat impacted by if I only have one instance of Windows 7 versus 100 instances of Windows 7. There is some, increase in the OT side for the likelihood, but the impact is where the OT team can really, really bring some power. And I did borrow this from usea.org that presented on behalf of the API 1164 directly. And so I put the link in here if anybody wants to go see this slide deck. It's really quite powerful. It's got some really cool mappings if you want to see it. I want to give full credit to this source. But one of the things I wanted to tease out from here is that risk is very, very dependent upon impact, as well as the threat factors, right? Now, again, these often come from outside, but they have implications inside, right? If it's a network-based attack vector, and we're talking Windows boxes down in layer 2 of the Purdue model, is that likely going up or down? Now, the impact is directly related to the asset, its function and operations, what protections we have for it. And so together, we need to get a lot of data around OT to be able to give this score. Now, those of you ask, we do it in IT, how come we can't do it in OT? Here's the answer. On the left is what IT often looks like. Most people know that IT, when we have a Windows upgrade from Windows 10 to 11 or 7 to whichever, that we have a project and the IT team comes through and they're very robust and they do change control and they do lots of communications, and then you show up on Tuesday and you have a new Windows 11 box. And so we have one type of OS to patch. I mean, we've got some server stuff. I'm not trying to oversimplify, but the reality is that IT is very homogeneous, very similar in size and shape and color, and we can do patches on Tuesday, and if something breaks, we use a ticketing system, and isn't that interesting to help us troubleshoot? The reality is that OT is completely different. It's the right side of this view. OT has any wild variation in number of asset types, of vintage, of fragility, of OEM, of vendor. There are OEM vendors that take something like a domain controller and put weird and wonderful new scripts in it to do something specific to their proprietary software. That means it looks and sounds like a domain controller, but maybe isn't necessarily that. And so we are constantly surprised with challenges in a myriad of devices and systems within the OT space, which means that our analysis needs to be able to accommodate those different types and perspectives, but our remediation plans also need to. Remember, we want to be able to understand what's in scope, which is getting the picture of this bucket of candy over here. We want to be able to understand risk, which means I need to understand the nuances and components of those different types. And the third is we need to be able to maintain. So that means reducing risk and tracking and reporting on a consistent basis. So taking it back to OT, what does that look like? And this one doesn't have the link on it, but I will give it to you verbally and I can follow. This is from the ISA 99 patch committee. So as I mentioned, the ISA 99 or IC 6443, a bunch of like-minded OT security professionals. A friend and colleague of mine, former colleague at Matricon, is one of the chairs of this particular document. And what they did was they wanted to try and capture what does patch analysis or patch management look like in OT? Because regulatory, again, is about understanding what's out there, but also reducing the risk and tracking it. And so let's take a snippet, a subshot, or a subset of what we're looking at, for example. And this is how we need to apply risk analysis in OT. This callouts are what I've added, but the actual workflow, figure 3, again, is in one of the ISA 99 documents put out by the patching committee. Very valuable insight, but this is a very typical approach and philosophy for OT. We first need to identify vulnerability and available patches, right? Again, in IT, it's mostly around Windows 11 and Server 2018 or 20, whatever they're up to now. In OT, it's a whole bunch of other systems as well. So we have to expand our ability to identify and find patches or workarounds. The next thing we need to know is, does it affect ICS? In IT, we don't necessarily care if it's a patch for that device. It says it's critical or it's security related, we're going to apply it. Better safe than sorry. Not an ICS. We need to take this first level of analysis, this decision tree, and decide if it's important to us or not. If it doesn't, we're going to go right back to operations. Not that we're going to stop while we do this, but this is something that absolutely has to happen. If it does affect ICS, the first thing we ask is, can we do something other than apply the patch? Because we don't want to take things down. And some of the questions you've added were, how do we do this? How do we safely manage OT assets in this space? And then once we get past that, is a workaround available or not? And this is usually having people understand more about the patch and the risk, but more importantly about the OT systems than you typically do in a normal patch cycle. If there's a workaround available, then we will schedule that patch eventually when we go to outage. We're going to put the documentation, we're going to go back to operations. If there isn't a workaround, we need to know operational needs and are they greater than risk? And this is where the real detail comes in, okay? What is the vulnerability itself and what is the system itself, okay? We talk about likelihood and impact. This is where it comes full bore into the OT environment. If I don't know enough about the vulnerability, other than simply it's a critical risk, I can't make an informed decision about whether or not I need to act. It may be a critical vulnerability, but it may be highly complex and it may be a local based or a physical attack vector. Well, if I know everything's protected by guards, gates, and guns, and it's highly complex, you need to be on site, maybe I can ignore that, right? And this is some of the acceptable analysis of risk that we need to do in OT. But if I don't know enough about that device, I can't have an intelligent conversation about it. Similar to the device's operation, its impact to safe operations, its position in the process. Is it safety related? Is it quality related? Is it control related? Is it a huge issue if I don't see the data from this device or if it goes offline for a while? So we take not only the need for greater level of granularity and understanding before we act because of operations, but we add that to this slide where I need to now take that same analysis and apply it to 20, 30, however many different types of systems by vendor, by function, by location, by geography, et cetera. And I can potentially get into an exponential need for data to be able to make informed decisions. So this is the challenge. Hopefully you framed what the challenge is. I want to now move towards a little bit about what the good news is, okay? So first, what are successful companies doing or using? They are embracing things that, again, may not have been chosen by the easy button. When I say the easy button, there were two that came before us here. In 2009, the whole industry decided they wanted to embrace whitelisting or lockdown technology. The theory was that devices in the OT environment were pretty static. And so we didn't need to worry about making changes. And so a lockdown technology like whitelisting was perfect. You set it and forget it. Honeywell spent considerable dollars and time trying to research and approve a couple of different platforms to go work on their Honeywell systems. And everybody thought this was going to be the end of security consulting and patching and et cetera. In fact, there are multiple vocal people in the speaking circuit that say, why ever patch? We can't do it, so let's move on. That's unfortunately not an option. The second coming of the silver bullet was what we're talking about today, or seeing a lot about today in the market, is anomaly detection capabilities. They're fantastic, this packet capture, at understanding behavioral alterations and anomalies, but that's what they were built for. They are trying to help you think that they can also give you your entire inventory vulnerability and patch levels. They can get some of it, and the more you get into it, the more capable you can become at it. But it takes a lot of time and effort, and you're still only seeing part of the circuit. You really actually need to embrace what you have for an inventory. You need to add the context of that asset to the inventory. I don't want to just know an IP address and an OS running on it or a vendor name. I need to be able to take actions. If I truly want to manage a program, I can't just have information. I need to be able to do things, reduce risk, adjust to the times, et cetera. I need to have a way to be alerted when something's going wrong or that I need to take attention. And most importantly, I need to be able to keep an eye on it. You would be surprised at how quickly an OT environment actually adjusts within this environment based on the things we're seeing. It's not as static as we would ever think. Now, the real magic is when this information can be automatically updated. Many organizations find that, well, we went to one that said they had an inventory. They handed us an inventory list. We did a walk down and we found they were wrong by 560%, almost six-fold increase with IoT, extra wireless cards, upgrades to equipment. And so really there needs to be a feedback loop. This information then lets me build a 360-degree view of the asset. Because when you are wearing your regulatory hat, you may be faced with a new release about Log4j, for example. You may be, one of the questions was, how do I head off unexpected audits? Well, you can't head off unexpected audits, but if I had all the information at my fingertips, I'd be able to pivot into what is my hardware inventory, my software inventory, or my vulnerability status, or my patching levels. How are the devices configured if I'm not patching? If I can't apply Bluetooth, can I disable the remote desktop? 24/7 staffed HMIs probably don't need remote desktop. This is where we start to build the running a chance of being able to keep up with these emerging regulations, but also to be able to pivot into different situations. There is reactive in the form of an audit or a newly released threats and vulnerabilities. And then there's proactive in the form of taking this information and proactively reducing risk in our attack surface and using this data to plan lifecycle management and upgrades, using this for training and awareness capabilities, improving existing technologies as the licenses come up. There's been huge investment and improvement in backups for OT, like using data deduplication and mirror imaging. This is where we really go from this reactive, oh my God, the auditors are coming, we're going to get fined, I don't know where to start, to now we're driving the bus, right? We're starting to show what we have, how we have it, what the context is, and building proactive plans and programs to react, but also the ability, very, very agile ability to pivot when something new comes down the pipe. Now, the way this is working, because one of the other big risks and challenges in OT is not only are we very, very different than IT, not only do we have as many assets as IT, but they're very, very different. And we have all these different analyses and questions to answer. We don't have bodies, and the bodies don't exist. So how are we going to manage the ongoing and the maintenance? Well, more and more clients are embracing a central team that can see a view of the entire fleet. This is valuable because I can take a central team and blend IT and OT. I can give IT and OT the ability to see my fleet and then see threats and vulnerabilities associated with that fleet. And they are now able to take contextual analysis and build a remediation or roadmap that is consistent across the organization. When you have the technology to automate the data collection and the remediation portion, you can even execute against that. And one of my case studies is going to talk about that, about this automated sort of architecture and how that works. But it's also allows you to involve OT at the plant floor for the last mile, but it lets you bring the data away from them and not bother them to be able to manage reporting, remediation, regulation, presentation to the CISO, to the board, or better yet, let's go get some budget because I'm looking at the dashboard here and we're going the wrong way for risk. So let me take that and pivot to the first case study. This is called Think Global, Act Local. Here's my first case study about Think Global, Act Local. One of our clients, global pharmaceutical company, they have tens of thousands of assets across 50 plus facilities worldwide, different geographies, different regions, different languages, different cultures, different regulatory expectations. Some built and bought and owned from the start, some through acquisition. And so they have a wide array of asset vintage, criticality, and origin. One of our power clients actually had 53 different control system vendors in their 12 generation facilities. That's not new, unfortunately. Wide array of asset vintage, criticality, and origin, various regulatory, board, and corporate security needs. But in general, they needed to react to threat. A threat is a threat, regardless of whether the board wants you to know about it or a regulatory entity wants you to know about it or what have you. And they had a shrinking headcount. They just couldn't keep people in the OT security. In fact, we have a client that grabs kids right out of school and puts them in a lab, and what they do is sit and look at the internet to look up application updates for security and then update a spreadsheet. Those kids quickly move on to other jobs as soon as they find something cooler to do in OT. So we need to find a way to do this. Now, this company, prior to working with this sort of Think Global, Act Local technology, and automated visibility, and then the ability to act on what they see through an automation, very, very OT safe, of course. I'm not going to get into the details of that unless people want near the end for questions. They ran against Bluekeep, and they did all of the manual efforts, the stuff I was talking about earlier with spreadsheets, basic understanding of user ownership and whatever. In many cases, they actually had to log into systems using a remote desktop to see what software was running on it. If it had Maximo, they'd contact the Maximo team. So lots of updates and manual tracking in spreadsheets. They didn't really, because they didn't have a definitive inventory or know what was on the device, they didn't really have a full understanding of scope. They had general ideas to scale, but nothing overly specific. They had to make many guesses and assumptions, again, by remote desktop into a device and seeing, sleuthing around and seeing how many people logged in recently, which accounts, and were they there recently, or they were there for a long time, or they currently logged in, let them get some sort of semblance of the criticality or the importance of the system based on how frequently it was touched and what it was doing. But there was a lot of guesses. And so they started to manually patch the process and the systems. And then the manual tracking had to begin. So as they populated the spreadsheet with the discovery, they then start to deploy patches and have to update that with the patch status and start to reduce things. They didn't really have a realistic option for putting compensating controls in. One of the scenarios around the Think Global, Act Local and Blue Keep is, while I'm deciding what order to patch things in an OT, because as you know, in OT, you crawl before you walk and you run. You want to maybe test a patch on a vanilla domain controller of the same OS version and make sure it bakes in for a day or two or a week before you go and apply it to HMIs and engineering stations, et cetera. So you want to do a crawl, walk, run, but in the meantime, with Think Global, Act Local, you can, instead of having to wait for that bake-in process, you could disable remote desktop on HMIs and engineering stations because there's people sitting at them. They don't need that. And you can immediately reduce your risk through a compensating control. They captured the total effort in internal hours and people diverted from their day jobs to chase this. And not releasing actual numbers, but there's an order of magnitude in the logos right there below the disgruntled employee they're having to work on this. It was a fairly significant number for 35,000 assets at 50 plus locations globally. And of course, during this time, not only was that the hours and time that these guys and girls spent chasing this down, that was that much time taken away from their day job. And that's not calculated here. This is just the burn rate of that team and what it took them to do. Now, once they deployed this architecture, along came Log4j. The central team started from a very different starting point. They had a three-dimensional view of all their assets. They had all of those things I showed in that cycle. They had the asset IP, the MAC address, the software, the vulnerabilities. They had user-defined tags that said this asset is critical or this asset is redundant. They had location of the asset. They had owner of the asset. They understood the software on it. And they were able to then make informed decisions about where Log4j was. Now, part of the prep work is that they used that architecture to automatically deploy a local-based profiling tool, not network-based scanning, not reaching out across subnets, not broadcast traffic. Go locally to the system, look locally, and bring the data back up. They had a dashboard in that reporting instance that the team could look at globally to see exactly what the profiling tool was returning for results. And they also were able to add alerting and monitoring. If you remember on the triangle, we want to understand assets, we want to have context, but then we also want to be keeping an eye on things. So they were able to add those three things immediately: a local profiling tool, a reporting dashboard to track it, and then a specific set of alerts to monitor in case something happened while they were working to reduce the risk. And all of this in the context of understanding exactly how many assets by type, location, function, et cetera. The patching team then started deploying files and began testing deployments where patching was possible. Non-patch systems were tuned in the same time to minimize risk. Compensating controls were applicable, like deleting library files or unused or not necessary software. And so they were able to very accurately, you can't just do on the IT side, put the patch in, hit go and deal with busted systems in the ticketing system. But they were able to go as far as OT could possibly go under these circumstances to significantly and proactively reduce risk. All the progress, because of that feedback loop that I showed you in Think Global, that automated update portion we talked about, all of the progress was updated in the corporate dashboards. Total effort, they only need to divert 3 core staff. And you can see they used a fraction of the hours and the time that were required before. Now, when we talk about regulatory and managing in this environment, the two things that probably should leap off the page here is the accuracy of the data that I have at my fingertips and the ease at which I'm maintaining it and keeping it up to date. I may have a dashboard that says 10 of these devices are not yet patched the way they're supposed to be, but I know that it's only those 10. I know where those 10 are and I know what they look like. This is the future of OT security. OT security without some semblance of automation and context is doomed to fail. It will not hold up. Trust me. We've seen many clients. Ask that power company that paid $10 million. This is the game changer. This is not an easy button. It's not hard. It's been proven for 15 years in OT, but this is the fundamental shift in OT security that in my 20-some years that I've been doing this, I think is going to finally make the change. Second case study for you, because we're talking regulatory, I wanted to give you a day-to-day workflow, right? Because one of those is an emergent threat, right? Something that you should be doing regardless of regulated environment or not. The second one, the more tedious and not so glamorous one, is when we have day-to-day functions that have to be paired to specific touch points and proof points in order to remain compliant with our change control, or before and after our baseline, or hash file checking, et cetera, et cetera. This is actually extracted from one of our existing regulated clients in NERC SIP. And this is a typical task list for them on once a month when they do patching for an entire week, every month, to be able to keep in compliance with managed regulatory requirements. What they do is they collect all the data, They collect a patch list for OSs, they export a vendor list of supported information, and then they have to look up all their other applications. One of the fun things about regulations is they take what we normally do and they make it even harder. So they'll take patch requirements for security updates and say you have to do it for all your software as well. So not just the OS, but the Wonderware and the Oasis and the Kiwi syslog that you're running in this environment. And so the problem becomes exponentially more challenging because there's no Windows update for Kiwi syslog and Wonderware, et cetera. So you have to do that manually. They then prepare the files and patches, maybe load stuff in WSUS, put vendor lists into WSUS, build subfilters, script a bunch of information, make sure you have it where you need to do. They're manually downloading files from those application sites and capturing the hash mark and screenshotting it and demonstrating it. They're then preparing tickets. All of this information goes into tickets, maybe snapshots and screenshots of the devices, the systems, the hash file. I go to wonderware.com, I show the hash file on the site, do a screen capture, I download it. I show it successfully downloaded screen capture. I then check the hash file. I do a screen capture of the hash file. I put all that into here. I then deploy the patches. As you know, with WSUS, you need to scan a system to make sure it needs it. Then you need to push it. Then you need to scan the system again to see if it took. And if not, you need to do it again, hence to verify the patch succeeded, troubleshoot if necessary. Once that's all done, I snapshot the device again, and I potentially put it back into the system and finally close the ticket. This is all very manual. It's all very structured. But it's also very manual, prone to error, and very, very tedious. When you bring in the ability to automate your software inventory by going to all your endpoints, when you bring in the ability to manage the automatic download of systems and patches, et cetera, you become much more automated. So these circles show how much, the more orange, the better off they are, how much automation was now introduced into these stages for this particular client. As you can see, overall, the effort estimate is that instead of taking a whole week of very long days to get this done, they're now done by about noon on Wednesday. Okay. What they're doing now is that they're able to pull down automated real-time software and OS patch lists. They can very easily create the vendor list in the back end and simply toggle the filter to say these are in scope for this vendor and these are the raw list of patches, et cetera. By the way our technology works that I'm proposing here is that we actually automatically calculate the hash file at the source, at the server that's dispatching, and at the agent and the endpoint. So there's not only an audit trail of the hash file, but it's actually recorded for you. No need for all these screenshots. We can capture current software status, a snapshot of the device very automatically, email that directly to a ticketing system. Patch deployment is significantly superior. You don't scan the device, push, and then scan again and hope it worked. You simply push, it gives you verification, you move on. We did a side-by-side comparison against WSUS once. We had 100% coverage in a lab with 7 minutes of effort. They had 75% coverage with 90 minutes of effort. Gathering the evidence again is also very straightforward, and then closing tickets because all of the information is semi-automated, not necessarily into the ticket system. You do still need to send data over, but the collection, analysis, and automation of a lot of the tasks made this a much more efficient and much safer and more secure and accurate regulatory practice. Last couple of slides, what should we do? As you go away from this, what do you want to take away from this? Where do we start? You need to first define and capture the requirements, right? Too many people have a very loose interpretation of what an inventory is. It's not just IP, MAC address, and OS version. For you to truly be able to make these informed decisions about compensating controls and can I apply a security concern or not, or am I worried about it, depends upon all those things that I identified earlier. If I don't understand the asset's complexity or its impact to my operations, and then I measure that against the fact there is a critical vulnerability, but it is this type of attack vector, or I have whitelisting and lockdown and I have a recent backup, I can't make an informed go or no go on that device. And so when you say inventory, I need to make sure that you understand what your objective is. Not just, do I have an inventory? Yes, I've got NERC 2 or CIS 1 and 2 for hardware and software inventory. What am I going to do with that to do vulnerability management, patch management, lifecycle management, incident response, recovery practice, et cetera? Your critical systems are going to have a different recovery plan than your non-critical. We need to then understand vulnerabilities, right? Scan-based isn't enough. We want to make sure we get to all of our devices, OS-based, network-based, embedded devices, you name it. Patches, it's great to know the full list. Do I need to include application patches? Do I need to sub-filter to only vendor approved? Do I only want to take action on those that have CVEs associated with them? What if I bring in threat data and say, hey, it's not approved by the vendor, but it's a critical risk. And by the way, there's an emergent threat in the wild that we need to be worried about. And then finally, in OT, the safety net, plan B, C, and D, compensating controls. To carry on a little bit, design and establish an organizational structure to properly support convergence of IT risk and OT environments. Big, long sentence. What I'm trying to say is the debate for years has been IT should do it because it's risk-based. And the other argument is, well, it's OT system, so OT should do it. The reality is that there's not enough bodies and the risk is evolving so fast, we need to be able to collaborate. I need to be able with my OT hat to say, I can't apply that patch. What other security or remediating controls can I apply? You, Mr. IT security expert, can let me know this. And then we check that with our compliance team that would satisfy. We document all that. We're now managing the program. We're managing risk. We're not just accepting it. We're not trying to patch something that we can't do. It absolutely has to be a collaboration. The architecture needs to be able to support that, to be able to give you the ability to run into those devices and to pull that data or to push information. We need to be able to scale small teams of expertise across multiple sites because they just don't exist. We don't want all the individual sites to be doing their own analysis, their own planning, their own deployment, their own tracking, because we will get 15 different ways of doing something and none of them will be consistent. You need to design and develop specific alerting and KPIs. If you're going to go to the market and you're going to go to the management and you're going to say, here's what we're doing and how we're doing it, it is absolutely paramount to say, okay, here's where we are today. Here's how we're getting better. Here's where we're falling behind. And here's what we're doing. It goes to regulatory, it goes to budget, it goes to support, it goes to progress. You absolutely need to know what it is you're looking for and what your targets are. That's why I brought up CIS 18. It has a maturity level to say, thou shalt have this practice, and this is how we measure if we've got there. And you could start at maturity level 1, work up to 2, and eventually 3, but that's where you start to move the needle on your overall program. And then you need a global reporting and tracking. Absolutely, the ability to spit this out into either the CISO or the compliance or the regulator's hands is the key endpoint of all of this. Rounding the plate to home here. In conclusion, OT security risk is not as hard as everyone thinks. I painted a complex picture because it's a complex environment. But everything I've said here today is all relatively straightforward and common sense. It's just a matter of doing the work to get the data and to bring it together in that context. This is not going to go away. Don't believe the hype on a silver bullet that I can simply listen on the perimeter and make all of your lack of insight and your understanding go away. We need to roll up our sleeves. We need to do the work. We've 20 years of technical debt, and many of these organizations that have been putting TCP/IP or Ethernet IP enabled devices on legacy equipment and never bothered or had the ability to build a security and maintenance program for them. The origin of OT was set and forget. I mean, I remember at Honeywell, we celebrated a client that had the same system 37 years later. But as we know, technology is maybe at best a 3-year refresh. And so those two worlds have collided and we need to find a way to navigate it. We can't ignore it. The key challenges are pretty straightforward. We need context, not just data. A vulnerability list is interesting, but relatively useless. An alert without context of the asset that's in scope or maybe being attacked may be insightful, but not enough for me to do anything about it. We also need to be able to act on risk, right? I always joke, I laugh at the commercial I see when I'm traveling to the States and there's a guy standing up and guns are going off and people are yelling and people are hiding under the desk and the people under the desk look at the guy standing there in a security guard uniform saying, aren't you going to do something? He says, no, I'm just a monitoring service. By the way, you're being robbed. Like it's interesting and it helps when you're at the CISO level and you don't know what you don't know, but it's not even the icing on the cake. It's not even the table stakes to get into this. It's just information, and you need to be able to act on it. And we need to be able to track progress. So the solution must be rich in information. All the info about assets, about their function, about their owner, about their criticality, about their compensating controls. You need to be able to act, not just plan A, B, or C, but you also need to be continuously updated. These are the hallmarks of what successful clients are doing. That is the majority of my planned presentation. I do have some questions, but I noticed there was at least one during the session. I'll pull that down and see if it's still there. Somebody answered it. Oh, yes, we can, of course, share the slides, Jim. Absolutely. I am going to just cherry pick a couple from the preloaded ones that came in. But I first just want to solicit, does anybody else want to ask one either through the chat or the Q&A before I turn to the preloaded questions that were submitted by some of the attendees today? I'll let you go ahead and type in there while I go pull one up. In looking at the list of questions, let's let me see. There's a few in here and they range wildly. There was a question from Hamid about how the regulations would apply to the OT environments. Well, all of the ones I showed you, Hamid, are regulations that are built explicitly for OT environments, either by OT practitioners or for OT environments. And so the actual application is being able to take those and saying, okay, I need an inventory so that I can then map vulnerabilities to it and then look for patches. So I'm hoping that I help to demonstrate a little bit of that today. How to keep OT machines patched and in compliance without affecting productivity. That's from Michael. Michael, thank you for the question. OT machines can't always be patched. I hope you saw that in what I was saying here, at least not during normal operating function, but we can understand what a risk is and potentially take actions as needed. Once we get into those actions, there is always a crawl, walk, run. And part of what I like about the inventory and the global approach is when I have a new patch I want to deploy, I am absolutely going to test it on vanilla devices that might go away and not cause me a lot of pain. Hence my advocacy for understanding your assets and categorizing them. I'm going to, for example, try a redundant domain controller in the DMZ, the 3.5 zone, before I tested critical HMI or engineering station. I'm going to bake it in on server 2012, for example, or 2016, and then I'm going to share with the rest of the fleet that 2016 has now been baked in for a week and we're safe. And we might be in parallel testing 2008 or Windows 10 or what have you. But it is very much a staged approach. And once I've got the first 50 or 60% I can with that, I go to plan B, which is kind of applied compensating controls. That's how we get away without affecting productivity. We absolutely can't just say we're patching on Tuesday. I don't know if that helps, but hopefully it answers your question. Can the Verve OTSM, OT inventory management also be used for IT? Absolutely. These are IT tools. They are a specific set of IT tools that have been built with additional OT precautions and insights, et cetera. They are equally as valuable in IT. Obviously, I'm able to map vulnerabilities to PLCs, relays, and controllers, so you don't need that in IT, but the vulnerability mapping and the endpoint management for networking gear and OS-based devices is absolutely portable, 100%. One of the questions about what does it mean when you said automating endpoint actions without causing OT risk? Let me just back up for that one. I'll give you one more case study, bonus time here. This is what I mean. In a Think Global Act Local scenario, we have a client that had 6 generation facilities, coal-fired, fairly complex environments. It was the middle of summer, so they're busy cranking out power for all the air conditioning units in the environment. So it was what they call a red letter day. In other words, nobody touch anything. But the CISO phoned and said, by the way, we've got some of that still, that Russian-built antivirus software on those devices. I don't want it. I need it gone by Monday morning. This is a unique challenge for a small team on a Saturday afternoon and having to do something by Monday morning, especially in a complex environment. What they did was they went to the software dashboard and they found 146 copies of that software across the 6 different locations. They then used the technology, which is agent-based for OS. They said, okay, any agent that has this version of software shall execute this uninstall command. But what they did was they set a flag on that command so that it didn't operate automatically. They then sent a list to each of these 6 sites and saying, of the 146, here are your systems. Here's the room they're in, the floor they're on, the rack they're in, the owner that they belong to, et cetera. And a technician from each of the sites was then able to take that very prioritized punch list for their location and go right to that room and right to that console. When they got to that console, they saw a little flashing light in the console tray. And the console tray said, hey, are you okay to accept this request to uninstall the software? Well, that technician phoned the control room and they said, I'm at this site and the device, this is what I'm doing. Here's the redundant, we're gonna switch over to the other. They said, yep, no problem. They followed their change control. That technician accepted the change, uninstalled the software, and then moved to the next system. Because there's that automatic feedback loop, this dashboard went from 146 to 140 to 130 all the way down, while all of these technicians had what I call the last mile of oversight. They were the ones actually touching the endpoints. The small team was able to track and prioritize and assemble and prepare, but OT got to do the yay or nay. They were able to say, we're going to do it or under these circumstances or at this time of day. They were able to go to all 146 and the software dashboard was updated and the report was sent to the CISO on a Saturday afternoon across 6 different physical locations with OT doing the last mile on all 146. They did that within 90 minutes. This is usually something that would take days or weeks for them to do by themselves, go find it out, figure out where it is. Is there something on this one? No. Is there something on that one? No. Having to hunt and peck to try and find these devices with laser precision and OT oversight, they were able to do exactly what they needed within 90 minutes. So that is, whoever asked the question, I apologize. There it is. That was Zara. That's what I mean, automating endpoint actions without causing OT risk. Other actions we have clients taking, for example, certain classes of assets like control room, HMIs, and engineering stations. We're using the technology at the registry level to physically disable or logically disable the USB ports, for example. That can be automatically sent, and that can also be enforced. Anyways, that's an example of that, an answer to that sort of question. I'm going to take one more, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap it up, unless I see any in the Q&A. No, I don't. Last one. Let's answer. Is there a website or publication which identifies every cybersecurity and privacy standard for every US state and every country worldwide? Unfortunately, Stephen, no. There's a joke cartoon I have on my desk here that says, here's a cartoon guy heading to a meeting, says, oh, what are you going to do? We're going to go and reconcile the 9 different standards we have. We have too many standards. And it says a while later, and the guy comes back and says, how'd it go? He says, we now have 10 standards. Unfortunately, there's no one. The NIST CSF is a really good overarching one. But if you're looking for that which is actually applied, you almost need to go to each of the individual governments. There are a number of industry bodies that are quasi-regulatory that aren't necessarily enforced. Different governments are strongly recommending things, but there's no one Wikipedia necessarily for that. I apologize. I think that's a good place to wrap. I thank everybody for coming, giving me an hour of your day. I know time is probably the most precious commodity amongst this group of people. I hope the time spent here was worthwhile. There's my email and phone number on the screen if you'd like to follow up with me directly. I welcome all feedback and comments. And again, good luck out there. Keep your eyes and ears open, and thank you for coming, and pay attention. We'll be sending, oh, hang on, one more soon. No, thank you, Derek. I appreciate you feeding the feedback. Thank you all for coming. So thanks, everybody, and have a great day. Take care.